Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In recent days, questions have been raised in the press and elsewhere regarding the presence of offensive weapon systems in Cuba. I believe beyond any reasonable doubt that all such weapon systems have been removed from the island and none have been reintroduced. It's our purpose to show you this afternoon the evidence on which we base that conclusion. Since July 1, over 400 reconnaissance flights have been flown over the island of Cuba by U.S. military aircraft. These reconnaissance flights provided the essential basis for the national decisions taken with respect to Cuba in October. They provided the basis for the military preparations necessary to support those decisions. They provided the evidence we were able to present the world to document the basis and the rationale of our action. The reconnaissance flights recorded the removal of the offensive weapon systems from Cuba, and they continue to provide the foundation for our conclusion that such weapon systems have not been reintroduced into the island. Mr. John Hughes, the Special Assistant to General Carroll, the Director of our Defense Intelligence Agency, will now present to you a detailed photographic review of the introduction of Soviet military personnel and equipment into Cuba, with particular emphasis on the introduction and removal of the offensive weapon systems. Mr. Hughes.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the historic photograph of the Cuban crisis. It was acquired with a high-altitude aircraft moving south-north over the western sector of the island of Cuba in the early morning hours of 14 October 1962. Note, if you will, that the photograph appears gray in color and tone. The reason is the early morning hour, and we are also observing at this time a Soviet MRBM unit that apparently recently has just arrived in the area. As the photo interpreters and intelligence analysts carefully reviewed this photography on 15 October, they noted 8 large missile transporters, 4 at this location, 3 at this location, and a single one at this particular location. In addition, the Soviets had already deployed in a tentative firing position 4 erector launchers, one here, another one here, and a 4th one at this location. No doubt the Soviets were employing the field expedient and making every effort to achieve an operational capability at these sites as quickly as possible. Lines of propellant vehicles were observed standing nearby. Note, however, the absence of any extensive trackage or activity. In addition to finding field MRBMs deployed in Cuba, considerable concern was evoked on 17 October 1962 when high-altitude cover provided the first positive identification of a fixed intermediate range launching site in the area of Guanahai and later in the area of Remedios. 2 4-launcher fixed sites were identified in the Guanahai area, one of which is shown on this aerial photograph. There are 4 launching positions, one here, another here, and 2 others at these locations. They are paired and focused on a central control bunker. Conduits lead from the central bunker area to the center of each of the pads. Notice that vehicle shelter revetments for equipment which must remain in the launch position during firing are nearing completion at these locations. At this time, a missile servicing building is roofed and nearing completion, while a nuclear warhead storage bunker is having the final touches accomplished with regard to roof construction. An assessment was made by the intelligence community to the effect that the field MRBM sites at San Cristobal and Sagua La Grande were designed to fire the 1,100 nautical mile Soviet medium-range ballistic missile. This particular weapon deployed in Cuba could reach all key target areas in the southeastern United States and such other important cities as Washington, St. Louis, and Dallas. Included within the range of the weapon fired from these MRBM sites also was the Panama Canal. The 2,200 nautical mile intermediate range ballistic missile could reach most key target areas in the North American continent, with the exception of a small portion of the northwestern section of the state of Washington and all of Alaska. Key countries in the northwestern portion of South America also came within range of this particular weapon system. The President directed that beginning 23 October 1962, on the day following his address to the nation, that United States military aircraft be directed in a low-altitude mode against the Soviet offensive bases on the island of Cuba, in order to provide us more finite data on the nature of the weapon systems being deployed. The reconnaissance versions of the U.S. Air Force 101 and the Navy F-8U were selected for this particular mission and are shown here. These aircraft swept in at altitudes well below 1,000 feet and caught the Soviets by surprise on 23 October 1962. Here is the launching site at San Cristobal number 1. The missile erector is under canvas cover at this location, but telltale cabling leads from the launch point to the covered generator command and control equipment in the wooded sector to the upper right on this photograph. A missile shelter tent measuring 100 feet in length and 17 feet wide has been completed. This is the place where the missile is kept and kept perfectly tuned prior to that time when it might be required at the launching position itself. The Soviets respond quickly to our low-altitude effort. They effect camouflage and concealment where possible. Here at San Cristobal Site number 1, we observed 3 Soviet MRBM missiles on transporters, 1 at this location and 2 in the lower portion of the photograph. Note, if you will, that the Soviets have stretched tarpaulin over these missiles, and then they have taken mud or paint and disruptively smeared it across these tarpaulins in order to break up the natural outline of the cylindrical object that lies beneath. In addition to canvas cover and disruptive painting, the Soviets also attempt camouflage. Nets are strung across these 2 missiles, again in an attempt to break up the natural outline of the cylindrical object lying beneath. We note that in addition to the single missile shelter tent formerly found at these sites, a second missile shelter tent is also being constructed at the launch position areas. This second tent is for the refire missile. The Soviets intend to provide a refire capability for each of their firing positions. In the upper portion of this photograph, you will see a firing position being improved. The white rectangular area is a concrete launch pad upon which the erector will soon be emplaced. Gentlemen, the intelligence community reported that on 28 October 1962, the Soviets did achieve a full operational capability for all MRBM facilities in Cuba. This is on the morning of the 28th this report is being made. In addition, they report that based on an analysis of the rate of construction they observe at the IRBM sites, the Soviets are aiming toward full operational capability for all IRBM facilities by 15 December 1962. The irony of this particular graphic is this. The intelligence analysts reported, based on their study of the photography, that the Soviets on this date had reached full operational readiness for their MRBM sites. As you know now, and as I know, Mr. Khrushchev, on 28 October 1962, agreed to dismantle these bases that on that date were just completed. The job that now confronted the reconnaissance planners in the military department was to determine a means to monitor the dismantling of the IR and MRBM sites in Cuba and to verify the removal of the missile components from the island. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition to moving equipment away from the MRBM launch sites, the Soviets methodically destroyed the fixed facilities in the vicinity of the firing position. This is San Cristobal Site number 2. A few days earlier, this was a concrete launch pad. This area also was a concrete launch pad. Soviet bulldozers have churned back and forth, disrupting the earth and leaving only chunks of concrete remaining. Soviet bulldozers at this location have churned back and forth and broken up these sites so that all that remain are chunks of concrete. In addition to removing equipment from the site areas, and in addition to destroying the fixed facilities in the vicinity of the launching positions, the Soviets carefully cleared all the remaining operational equipment and debris from their site locations. The job, again, confronting the reconnaissance planners during this particular phase was to ensure that the missile equipment, the missile components that were being removed from the launch site areas, was being taken to ports and removed from the island of Cuba, and not simply being redeployed at some other location or hidden at some other location. High-altitude aircraft swept the island, and all the naval facilities and seaports were carefully checked. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States did not just ensure that the missile alone left the island of Cuba. We ensured that the missile system left the island of Cuba. All components of that system were carefully counted as they left the site area, as they reached the port motor pools, and as they were loaded on Soviet ships. Here is one of the parking areas near the port of Mariel, one of the pier areas. Here we observe and carefully count with our low-altitude photography the Soviet oxidizer trailers from the MRBM sites, the Soviet fueling trailers from the MRBM sites. Other fueling and oxidizer trailers are shown at these locations. The specially configured IRBM fueling trailer noted at Guanahai number 1. They're also counted and tabulated as they move into the area prior to shipment away from the island. Missiles, including 4 MRBMs under canvas cover and on a transporter, are noted in the upper left corner of the photograph. A few days later, we checked the port of Casilda on 6 November. The MRBM missiles on transporters have been moved southward from that temporary storage area, and 6 of them have been placed on the Soviet ship Kurchatov. Here are the 6 missiles under canvas cover and deck loaded on this particular ship. The ship is nearing the completion of its loading cycle. Forward hatch covers are closed. Rear hatches are being closed. And here Soviet crewmen and technicians await in line or go up the gangway here in loading the ship itself. Note the ship is under steam and about to move away. We will observe this ship leave this harbor area in a few hours. This shadow is cast by a RF-101 reconnaissance aircraft as it moves in over its target area at 600 feet. The next day, the Kurchatov leaves and another ship moves in, the Komsomol. Here again, we had this type photography to see what the Soviets were loading on their ships and to ensure that indeed the missile systems were leaving the island. We can carefully monitor the erectors being pulled down from Sagua La Grande, count them, and see them loaded on Soviet ships, one of which is deck loaded at this location. We can actually see into the holes of these Soviet ships and can see the equipment, which includes fueling trailers already placed there by large cranes. When these ships reach the area of the quarantine, United States surface craft and aircraft effect inspection. As the United States destroyer H-78 pulls alongside the Soviet ship Volgalis off Cuba, the Soviet crewmen tear back the tarpaulin cover, exposing the Soviet MRBM on transporter beneath. A helicopter stands off the Soviet ship Bratsk, and here the tarpaulin cover has been pulled back, exposing the Soviet MRBM ballistic booster minus nose cone. It measures 60 feet in length and is tightly wrapped in an all-weather protective covering. The Soviets removed their 42 missiles from Cuba on these 8 ships. In these numbers, from these ports, on these dates, 5 through 9 November. The next most serious problem confronting the United States following the removal of the offensive missiles from the island of Cuba was the continued deployment and assembly of the Soviet Beagle IL-28 bomber. This particular bomber could carry a bomb load in excess of 6,000 pounds, to ranges out near 600, to a radius of about 600 nautical miles. It could reach key target areas in the southeastern United States. 42 of these unassembled bombers were delivered to the island of Cuba. During the next few days and weeks, we observed with high and low altitude photography the progress of the Soviets and the Cubans in assembling these particular bombers. As I mentioned earlier, at San Julian Airfield, 33 of these unassembled bombers were delivered in crates. Of these 33, 13 were broken out from the crates and assembly begun. Of these 13, 7 reached final assembly stages and were considered as flyable. And of these 7, 4 were considered to be the trainer version. So frankly, the Soviets and the Cubans never reached full or operational status or readiness with their offensive bombers on the island of Cuba prior to their being removed. Chairman Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the bombers and remove them from the island on 20 November. The job again of the reconnaissance aircraft was to provide the means, or to be the means, to monitor disassembly of the bombers and to verify the removal of the components from the island. Again, the high-altitude aircraft swept the island. They searched the port areas to determine which ones would be used for the removal of Soviet offensive bombers from the island. They checked the roadways, the railheads. Finally, it was found that the Soviets were moving the bomber fuselages from Holguin to the port of Nuevitas in eastern Cuba. And the bombers that were located at San Julian Airfield in western Cuba were being moved to the port of Mariel. The Soviet ship Kasimov departs Mariel on 5 December with 15 more IL-28 bombers, deck-loaded. 11 are in crates, and 4 are under canvas cover at these locations. Gentlemen, these ships, when they reach the area of the quarantine, are inspected by United States naval surface craft and aircraft. Here, in response to a request of the captain of the Soviet ship that he permit inspection and counting of the Soviet bombers, the Soviet captain directs that the crews dismantle on the decks of the ships the shipping crates. The end sections are pulled off, and the top sections are stripped back, exposing the IL-28 fuselage crate. Gentlemen, all 42 bombers observed in Cuba that were later observed deck-loaded on Soviet ships were inspected in this manner. And all 42 of them, some of which were in crates, were fully exposed as they departed Cuba. With regard to the bomber threat, then, 3 Soviet ships, the Okhotsk, Kasimov, and Krasnograd, removed the 42 bombers observed at San Julian and Holguin Airfield from the island of Cuba. The ports selected were Nuevitas and Mariel, and these ships departed Cuba on these particular dates. The Soviets deployed 5 categories of defensive weapon systems on the island beginning sometime in August and September. The air defense systems that were deployed included the surface-to-air missile, known as the SA-2. It also included the high-performance interceptor fighter, known as the MiG-21. Key or critical coastal areas were protected by a coastal defense cruise missile system deployed at 4 known and an additional possible location. In addition, guided missile patrol boats provided a mobile launching capability for anti-shipping work when 12 Komor-class patrol boats were delivered to the island. And finally, Soviet ground forces at 4 locations have also been identified on the island of Cuba, and they, with their equipment, are still found on the island. Color photography was employed with great success over these locations in Cuba. Here is a color view of the Soviet SAM site at La Coloma, Cuba. Again, the characteristic road pattern and the 6 centrally positioned firing positions, I should say 6 firing positions focused on a centrally located guidance area. Notice, if you will, that 3 missiles are uncovered. 1 here, another here, and another here. In addition to the deployment of surface-to-air missiles, the Soviets also deployed in Cuba the fish-fed, the MiG-21 fighter interceptor. This particular aircraft is equipped with air-to-air missiles, can reach altitudes of 40,000 feet, and speeds of 1,000 knots. On 10 November, low-altitude photography provided us something interesting and new concerning the Soviet MiG-21 aircraft in Cuba. We found, interestingly enough, near these aircraft on this date, air-to-air missiles. Here's the AA-2, a Soviet air-to-air missile with a range of 6 nautical miles. It's positioned near the delta-winged or configured MiG-21 aircraft. The Soviet crew is placing a launcher beneath the wing, a launcher rack. Key beach areas in Cuba are defended by coast defense cruise missiles. These missiles are aerodynamically configured and have a range of 40 nautical miles. We have 4 confirmed operational sites. One at Banas in eastern Cuba, one at Siguinea on the Isle of Pines, and 2 confirmed sites in the vicinity of Havana, Santa Cruz del Norte and Campo Libertad. An excellent photograph of one of the typical operational sites is shown here at Siguinea on the Isle of Pines. Here the Soviets took the highest promontory on the island. They dozed it down. Then they emplaced 2 missile firing positions, each of which were earth revetted, one here and one here. Inside was the 34-foot-long rail launcher, uncovered at this location and canvas covered at this location. The guided missile patrol boat, nicknamed the Comor, was deployed at 2 naval bases in Cuba. One, Mariel in the west, and where 8 of these boats were identified, and Banas in the east, where 4 of the boats have been identified. This is an enlargement of that pier area from our low-altitude photography. The boats, the Comor boats, measure 83 feet in length. They weigh 66 tons, and on the aft end, they have 2 missile firing canisters. These canisters measure 20 feet in length. The missile fired from this boat is estimated to have a range of 10 to 15 nautical miles. It's primarily a mobile anti-shipping missile launching platform. Soviet ground forces were deployed in Cuba sometime after mid-September. The first photographic evidence we had of these ground force locations came on 17 October. They are deployed at 4 major and several smaller locations. Each of these locations is characterized by a highly mobile armored task group. They include assault guns, tanks, tactical rocket launchers, anti-tank weapons, and a motorized infantry battalion. In addition, at these 4 locations, we find the modern Soviet T-54 tank with 100-millimeter gun. 35 to 40 of these tanks are identified at each of the locations. Here are the T-54 tanks under canvas cover, and here are the T-54 tanks uncovered with hatches open, Soviet crews working on them, and tubes being rotated. More modern Soviet ground force fighting equipment was also observed. Here's the tactical rocket launcher, the Frog, in a Soviet motor pool or garrison area at Remedios. Here's the refire missile on a missile transporter, along with your associated guidance equipment. Notice, if you will, on this graphic, other more modern Soviet equipment, including 5 130-millimeter rocket launchers here, the standard Su-100 assault gun, and other T-54 tanks under canvas cover. In addition to carefully monitoring the remaining defensive forces on the island of Cuba, United States reconnaissance aircraft have effected continuous surveillance of former Soviet offensive missile and bomber bases. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, there is little doubt that the Soviet Union did embark upon a bold venture to establish clandestinely a major offensive weapons base in the Western Hemisphere. That the United States was able to deter this effort and is now able to monitor the remaining defensive forces is in large part attributable to the reconnaissance photography that we have reviewed this afternoon. Thank you very much.
In summary then, ladies and gentlemen, we have recorded the entry of Soviet offensive weapon systems into Cuba, and we've recorded their removal. In addition, we've reported the introduction into Cuba of substantial quantities of Soviet military personnel and Soviet military equipment, defensive arms. Soviet military personnel on the island, including technicians, increased, we believe, to a total of approximately 22,000 by roughly the 1st of November. That total, as Mr. Hughes reported to you, has been reduced by the disembarkation, the removal of about 5,000 men from Cuba and their shipment to the Soviet Union, leaving a total of about 17,000 Soviet military personnel, including technicians, in Cuba today. Included in that total of 17,000 are 4 Soviet combat forces, each force approximating 1,000 to 1,250 men in strength, roughly 5,000 men in total for the 4 forces, each force being the equivalent approximately of one of our reinforced battalions. Recently, our reconnaissance has revealed that certain equipment of these Soviet combat forces, namely that associated with the tactical rocket units, has also started to be moved out of the island back to the Soviet Union. The United States maintains a continuing and an effective high-altitude surveillance program covering the island of Cuba. Photographic coverage of the entire territory of Cuba is obtained at least once a week. That coverage provides surveillance of key areas, port areas, airfields, naval bases, cruise missile sites, Soviet ground force garrisons, and certain of the Navy logistical centers. In addition to this weekly island-wide coverage, individual high-altitude flights for more detailed coverage of specific objectives are scheduled whenever receipt of intelligence indicates the need for such additional reconnaissance. Low-level reconnaissance aircraft are kept on a 24 alert basis for use whenever required. And supplementing this program, the reconnaissance aircraft of the United States Navy continue to photograph all Soviet shipping arriving or departing from Cuba. The Soviet Union did attempt to establish clandestinely a major offensive weapons base in this hemisphere. The United States was able to deter this effort, and the United States is now monitoring the remaining Soviet personnel and equipment in Cuba through reconnaissance activities of the type which we have described to you today.